Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the La Colina Wash Process Guatemala from Blind Tiger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Blind Tiger, based out of Old Town, Maine. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before, including most recently when we reviewed the Tima, a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. And longtime viewers of this channel might be familiar with this coffee, as we reviewed it from the barn last year and enjoyed it so much it ended up on our top 10 coffees of 2022 list. So I do know what this coffee is capable of, and it'll be interesting to try Blind Tiger's take on it, as this right here is day 30. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. However, with this one, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this one, as we alluded to in our previous Blind Tiger review, they do roast on that medium light side of that spectrum. This one, however, felt it had a slight bit more development than that Tima, which is to say that it's still lighter than a lot of the coffees we've had from Onyx and Sweet Bloom recently. If anything, it's a little bit more on par with some of the coffees we've had from Sweet Bloom in the past. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and interestingly, it came out a slight bit more smoky than initially expected. However, it made up for it exceptionally well by offering a beautiful caramelized aspect to the cup, very much reminiscent of a lot of that candied sweet components that we've experienced from their coffees in the past. There is a slight floral herbality to the cup, very much in line with the listed hibiscus that they have on here, as well as a nice spice quality that's also in line with the snickerdoodle components that they have listed on here. So for the most part, the descriptors that they have felt very spot on. A lot of the profiles in this one were quite well defined, as there's interestingly a strong cinnamon sugar component to it. The only thing that's really holding this coffee back was that ever so slight smoky component to it, but otherwise, I was actually really impressed by this first start. Day 15 opted for the Chemex, and it did offer a very slight floral honey aspect that complemented a lot of the herbal floral components in the cup, as the listed hibiscus was definitely present yet again on this day. A little bit more bright than expected, as they do have a caramel apple note listed on here, and you can see those things as there's a very bold and prominent brown candy caramel sweetness, very well defined in that regard. But in addition to that, there's plenty of that apple brightness to it. So I think kind of putting those two notes together, while those flavor profiles, they seem to be isolated and separate, I can see it kind of being put together, given that you're experiencing both of those things in notable abundance, as there's a robust caramel candied sweetness yet again here on this day. So really enjoying this coffee as of this moment. Still continues to remain in line with a lot of the things that they have listed on here. Day 17 opted for the April Brewer, and this is the most vibrant this coffee has been up to this point. I do begin to wonder whether or not Blind Tiger's coffees might be better with flat bottom brewers, because every single time I seem to run it through the April Brewer, it seems to have some really nice results, as it's slightly more candied sweet at the forefront, with once again an emphasis on that listed caramel aspect to it. Plenty of big, bright apple with a notable amount of brightness, complemented by more of a stronger spice-like that continues to be reminiscent, at this time I would describe as a spiced chocolate cake. Even then, very defined, very notable, and a lot of prominence and vibrancy to this cup as well. Day 19 opted for the V60 with slightly lower temperatures, and the cup's the best it's been to this point, interestingly enough, with a little bit more of a focus on that strong caramel candied sweetness, complemented once again by that very notable herbal florality once again. And continuing to offer a lot of the spice-like components to it as well. There's an abundance of sweetness that is contrasted well by the zingy brightness that's reminiscent of that tart green apple. Interestingly enough, this one seemed to have just a little bit more definition to that apple-like component to it than I typically experience. So overall, I really enjoyed this day. It was a very nice day of this coffee, but it's actually going to improve from here, as On day 21, we did the same thing, opted for the Chemex, and while it was still offering plenty of the caramel-like sweetness, it just didn't feel as well defined, and I felt like at this point it was probably best to just stick with the V60 going forward, as it didn't have the same sort of sweeter cinnamon spice quality to it either. Herbality a little bit more pronounced, but not quite as well defined either, so it's still very solid, but this is me being a little nitpicky based off of brew method, as I seem to have had a much stronger preference towards the V60. And that will be demonstrated here on day 23, as we opted for the V60 with higher temperatures and a more fine grind. And I was interestingly surprised by how this one turned out, as this was by far the best the coffee had been up to this point. And a lot of the reason I didn't necessarily think that this would yield the most positive results were because of that initial smoky quality I had experienced. However, what really seemed to give this coffee the best moment it's had is much more sweetness. That caramel sweetness, definitely very strong, definitely very pronounced, definitely very vibrant, with the floral components also being a little bit more sweet. And that's not necessarily something I was expecting, as I did fully expect it to be a lot more in line with that herbal aspect we had experienced up to this point. But the entire cup just felt much more vibrant, and that was definitely worth the trade-off for me, as there was even a slight soft fresh fruit component to it that I wasn't expecting. Definitely the best day of this coffee up to this point, and this would kind of set the trend for it going forward. As on day 25, same adjustments, back through the V60, and it's reached a really nice point of consistency as it continues to remain a very sweet coffee with a heavy emphasis on the caramel and herbal aspects to it. So in a way, you could say that this is slightly Pepe Hijón-like, because it offers those two things which are very much present and prominent in a lot of those Pepe Hijón coffees, most specifically that brown candied sweetness and that herbal component to it, if maybe not quite as strong, as sweet and as pronounced, but it still is offering a lot of those aspects and components to this one, which is very nice. Little to add in terms of the cup, plenty of brightness as well. Day 27, the cup has continued to remain consistent. I ran out of space for my notes, which is basically to say an abundance of brown candied aspects, complemented by an abundance of the herbal florality once again. So notes reached a point of consistency, though this coffee has at the very least been pretty consistent in terms of what it's offering. It's just been a matter of what's going to be the most well-defined and vibrant part of this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so let's start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yes, now obviously it's not going to be quite as clean as the Tima was, but even then it still offers that classic level 4 clarity you would expect for a wash processed coffee. So nothing too much to add to that, just in line. If there's anything else I want to say about it though, is that this coffee did have probably above average definition for what this coffee is in terms of roast profile and origin. So credit to them on that. Once again, it just might be the Colina coffee, as the Colina last year we reviewed was the only, I think, Guatemalan coffee that wasn't a Gesha we've ever scored at that level 5. Really impressive La Colina coffees in general. Finish, level 4. Yes, and this one right here, nothing too strong, prominent, overly long-lasting. Caramel aspect to it, sweet and pronounced, and then the brightness also a little bit present in the finish, but those things seem to finish off pretty even and well, so don't have too much to add to that. Level 4 seems a good fit for it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, this is a very sweet coffee, and if anything, I could say that it was on the higher side of the level 4. So many of those caramel aspects, those brown candied aspects, very sweet in this one. The adjustments did seem to yield even more vibrancy and sweetness in general, so level 4 definitely seems justified on this one. Florality, level 4. Yes, and that's one of the notes I've been harping on the most throughout discussing this coffee, as I would say it's the second most pronounced characteristic to it. Hibiscus. I've had so many coffees in my life that taste like hibiscus, and this right here had in a very well-defined manner, so definitely justified that red floral herbality present within this one right from the onset, so definitely justified there at that 4. Spice, level 4. Possibly a slight bit generous, and I'll be completely honest, one of the main reasons why I was interested in this coffee was because it did have that snickerdoodle note, and snickerdoodles are my favorite cookie in the entire world, so I was hoping for maybe a little bit more of the cinnamon sweetness. This one could have possibly been a priming effect, as I felt like it was present, but at the same time those other components were much more pronounced for me. Even then, I feel like it's kind of distinct enough. So maybe the other two components were a little bit more well-defined, but the spice-like quality to this one was pronounced. I couldn't necessarily say that any of the other snickerdoodle qualities, like the, we'll say, sugar cookie in general, was present, but there was at the very least a spice-like quality for me. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, and I don't think I've mentioned the chocolate too much. I feel like that's a little bit more of the classic characteristic you would get from a Central American coffee like this. And it is what I was experiencing to kind of complement a lot of the other things, most specifically the caramel, which you will also see at the level 4. That, of course, being the most pronounced characteristic for me in this coffee. Right from the onset, I said, wow, this has just some wonderful caramelized sweetness to it. And that's obviously going to be the thing I appreciated the most about this coffee. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the body. Level 3. I feel like that's probably what you might have expected given the origin as well as the brew method for this coffee. Medium bodied, possibly maybe had some slightly higher expectations for it, but great texture to it in general. I'm fine with it being at that medium body level. Acidity, level 3. That's probably one of the more interesting aspects, as I did take note of the brightness right from the start. I did make this tasting wheel side by side with the Tima, so I noticed a little bit more brightness in that coffee, and I think that's why this one was toned down ever so slightly at that level 3. Still enough of it to maybe be on the slightly higher side of level 3, but not quite justified at that level 4 mark. Citrus, level 3. That's always the best place to put the apple-like characteristics to it, and given that there was very much that apple-like brightness, but not to the point where it justified that level 4, I feel like level 3 was a great place to put that. And as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I don't think that there's too much else worth discussing, though. I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. If we're comparing these two coffees side by side, then I did like the Barnes version of it last year better. And it's because that coffee was unique in terms of the wonderful clarity and definition of the profile of that one. That's not to say that this one doesn't necessarily have that. As I've kind of alluded to, some of the factors, some of the aspects in this one were quite well pronounced, quite well defined, but maybe not to the same extent that La Colina was last year. Even then, this one had a little bit more of my profile sort of coffee, as that brown candied sweetness that was present within it is something that I very much enjoy. And I even mentioned earlier that this at times felt like Pepe Light because it offered a lot of the Pepe Hijón characteristics. Maybe not necessarily as sweet as that coffee, but even then it offered so many of those wonderful qualities in general, and that complementary hibiscus-like component at times did make it feel like I was drinking a very nice coffee. So I have a lot of positive things to say about it, even if it wasn't necessarily quite as good as my experience with it last year. There are a lot of really nice things to pull away from this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to? Well, there are quite a few actually, and I think the first direction I should point somebody towards is somebody that does like their sweeter caramel components, because this one right here had that right at the forefront and was pronounced throughout. And then if you do enjoy your kind of more, we'll say, herbal floral components to it, then this one had that as well. As hibiscus has really grown on me when it comes to coffee, mostly because some of my more enjoyable coffees have had that, and it does remind me of maybe some of those other coffees. In addition to that, nice definition for this one overall in general. I always want to keep in mind the roast profile when suggesting coffee like this, because this one, as mentioned, a slight bit more development, even if it isn't necessarily an overly developed coffee. It does at times have an ever so slight smoky quality to it, so that's something that should be taken into account. But if those factors seem to suit you, then I think this would be a pretty good fit, and it's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Colina wash processed Guatemala from Blind Tiger Coffee. Thank you for watching.